Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum viewers. I'm your host S.M. Hali with another edition of Defense and Diplomacy. 2012 is a very important year for the region. The countdown for the drawdown of the US forces as well as its allies in Afghanistan has already begun. 2012 is also the year of the presidential elections in USA, which will definitely have a bearing on what has been termed as the end game in Afghanistan. The roadmap for it is going to be treacherous, precipitous, as well as dangerous. Does Pakistan have a role in it? But before we come to that, let me introduce my panelists, which is comprising of very eminent ones. We have Air Vice Marshal Shehzad Chaudhry, former senior Air Force officer, as well as he has served as High Commissioner in Sri Lanka. Welcome. We have with us Amna, who is from the Institute of Strategic Studies, and she has based her studies on Afghanistan and Fatah. Welcome. We have with us another young man, and it's good to listen to the youth. He is from Washington, Mr. Shehzad. Let's take the example of Joe Biden, who in his recent comment said that the Taliban were never our enemy, quote unquote. Is that a U-turn, or is that a U-turn?
I think that's more realism hitting in the American policy. We can imagine that from fight, talk to fight, talk, build to Taliban now not being a direct threat to the US, I think is how the progress in their own policy has evolved, which is rather good to see as far as the region is concerned. And I think that's what Pakistan has been saying for a long time now. I think the last few months have been rather slow as far as Afghanistan is concerned, but that shouldn't mean that it is all negative. It's all very positive in the way that things are developing in Afghanistan. We see that although the two conferences, Istanbul and Bonn, did not deliver much in terms of how the future roadmap would be, but I believe that Chicago would be the right time in April for that to deliver, and also add to President Obama's sort of strength in terms of his re-election bid. So I think that looks like a reasonably good bet.
No, but to add to it, you see the choice of Doha, and if Zabiullah is to be believed, the Taliban have been permitted to set up a political office.
So that is how it is all sort of evolving itself into. There's now an office opening up in Doha, as we all are aware. So these things indicate.
But I believe Hamid Karzai was more inclined towards either Turkey or Saudi Arabia.
Well, I don't know why, but whatever. The situation is that I think Doha is a consensus sort of a locale for that, and that's what is agreed upon. Pakistan has agreed to it, and now we understand that Karzai has also agreed to it. So that will give us, give them at least, Taliban, a neutral venue to interact, when the Americans to interact with them or as a constant feature, and they will have more sort of reliable people sitting there rather than picking up a couple of shopkeepers and getting to talk to them and finding out later that they've been talking to the wrong people. So I think that is a very reassuring thing. I think 2012 will indicate much more and much better as to the positive progress in Afghanistan.
Right. Let me solicit the opinion of Amna. Pepe Escobar, I suppose you've been reading him, and in his latest article, The Roadmap to the Endgame in Afghanistan, he uses a very interesting simile. He talks about the new Tom Cruise movie Mission Impossible, in which he's jumping up and down the Burj Hotel in Dubai, and he says that the choice of Doha is something like that. How do you look at the concessions which the US government is giving to the Taliban?
Well, I'd just like to begin by saying that first, I think it's taken the Americans a little too long. As Shehzad Saab said, Pakistan has always been saying that you need to bring the Taliban into the political process. And it's interesting, you asked about the Americans. I think it was inevitable that the Taliban had to be included into the political process, but as I say, I think it's taken them too long. Interestingly, why Qatar? If you remember initially when talks were going on, talking about maybe Turkey or Saudi Arabia as a possible place. Now when Qatar was mentioned initially, even the Afghan Peace Council and Karzai showed their resentment as into why Qatar was chosen as the so-called neutral place. But I think we'll have to just now wait and see as to how the developments unfold. I was recently in Germany, and there was a small Afghan delegation, primarily of Taliban commanders. It was kept very hush-hush.
But they had a very important meeting with the Bundestag.
The Bundestag, exactly, where there was Mullah Zaif and Mutawakkil. And apparently the Taliban themselves wanted Qatar instead of Saudi Arabia and Turkey, because these countries, primarily Saudi Arabia, has had stakes in Afghanistan. And Qatar has really been neutral when it comes to Afghanistan. So I think that's probably why Qatar was chosen.
Right,
as
but as the Air Marshal also said, that the Chicago conference is going to really, crystallize some of these concepts of the end game. Shahzad, Qazi, let's look at some of the concessions with the US is, I would say, bending backwards to accommodate the Taliban. Initially, they asked the Taliban, if you remember at the London conference, they gave them 3 conditions. One of them was to give up the arms. The second was to snap ties with the Al-Qaeda. The third was, abiding by the constitution, which of course they have not been contributed to. They disapproved of laying down the arms, but they have given an inclination that they might, snap ties with the Al-Qaeda. But look at the people that the US government is, if media reports are to be believed, are being released. For example, Maulana Muhammad Fazl, a staunch Taliban who is also known as the Butcher of Kandahar, who had, if you recall, was responsible for the murder of a number of Iranians or Iranian origin Hazaras. So how do you look at these concessions that are coming about?
I think, as Shehzad Saab said, first of all, there is a bit of realism involved. And it might appear that it's becoming a bit late, but it's also a result of, how the Americans, first of all, saw their priorities. They thought that, one last military push would be important before we can go and sit at the table, primarily because I think the Taliban have been in a position of strength. What we're now calling bending over backwards, yes, it's true, but I think it's also, again, just a very, very realistic way of moving forward. And some of these things,
talking about Mullah Muhammad Fazl,
right?
S. Bhadra Kumar, I'm sure you know him, a former Indian diplomat who is also a columnist now. In his latest column, The Trump Card of USA in the Afghan Endgame, he mentions that Mullah Muhammad Fazl is actually the trump card, because by releasing him, they are pleasing Mullah Muhammad Umar and paving the way for the staunch Taliban leadership to participate in this conferences which are likely to come about for peace.
Right. And I mean, and some of those people's involvement is also quite important, because some of the people who are already out, like Mutawakkil and Zaif, there are definitely lots of questions about how close are they, actually to the existing leadership. How dependable are they, and can they actually even deliver the peace? Can they influence the leadership, that is currently not in the limelight, so to speak, that is not actually participating. And from what I understand, these people's involvement is quite important, because they may actually have somewhat, more influence.
No, but does it, give a very strong message to Iran, because Tehran is not going to look at it very kindly.
Right.
And at the moment, the relationship between the US and Iran is fairly strained.
Sure.
So is it a precursor of a military action against Iran to sideline them?
I don't think so. I mean, yes, at every instance, Hillary Clinton and others have said, yes, all options are on the table. But I don't think that at this point in time, the Obama administration wants another military engagement, or even the American sort of military intelligence establishment wants to get involved. I think, yes, they would like to have people who the Iranians do not particularly like in Afghanistan as a way to keep the pressure on the Iranians. Also, perhaps, have people that they may end up having agreements with on the Iranian side of the border, whether it's in capacity of warlords or governors, etc. But I don't think that it's a way to sort of pave a military intervention or a strike inside Iran.
So, Air Marshal, I would like to draw your attention to an article, rather a news item, which has appeared in the Wall Street Journal today. It reveals that the Sunni Ittihad Council was paid a sum of something like 37,000 plus US dollars to have, demonstrations in Pakistan against the Taliban. But unfortunately, some of them ended up having demonstrations pro this assassin of Governor Salman Taseer. So the US is now having second thoughts about, taking this kind of action.
Yeah, I mean, the Salafi influence within Afghanistan has been of concern to most players in Afghanistan, including the Afghan, the typical centrist Afghan Muslims, as well as in Pakistan. It's a major influence in many ways. also for the US, when you look at the fact that the Al-Qaeda perhaps represents the core such a characterization of Salafi Islam, and that seemingly is what has influenced the larger Al-Qaeda entity. So it becomes a central focus, but it does not really mean that that is where the Taliban of today seemingly are centered. I think the Taliban are a much more pragmatic entity today as well, having suffered for the last 10 to 11 years in terms of how they've been through the turmoil, the difficulties in Afghanistan, the losses that they've suffered, the displacement that they've suffered for all these years. I think has also brought about a pragmatism, and we've been saying this for a long time within Pakistan in our discussions, and we've said that there is a possibility, and we haven't yet investigated that fully, but there's a possibility to look at the Taliban and say, are they really Islamists, or are they nationalists in the way that they're fighting the American forces? So if you perhaps make a differentiation of being Islamist or a nationalist, you begin to make a possibility that is there a reason now for the Americans to continue their war against the Salafi Islam as such? So, I'm aware of the fact that they did use their resources to try and influence what is called the centrist Islam or the Brelvi Islam in Pakistan, to try and counter the growing influence of the Salafi Islam. But it really doesn't meet the purpose. As long as you are tied to the larger objectives of your end game, and the larger objectives are to seek inclusivity as well as to seek peace and stability. Now, if those are the three major items, then you got to take everybody along. You cannot really trash somebody into the dustbin in terms of being a Salafi or whatever, or assuming that the Taliban belong to that particular cadre. I think that is now coming to unfold itself, and it's coming out to be more realistic, and the way the Americans look at it hopefully will be much more pragmatic.
So across the board, perhaps realism is setting in, but Amna, let's talk about the other players in the region when we are talking about the end game. You see, let's talk about Russia, let's talk about China, who are insisting that the SCO has a more important role to play in the end game rather than the US and its allies. How do you look at that?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, China now, it's, apart from the copper agreement, that it's got investment in Afghanistan. Russia, I think, has been quite quiet even now. I mean, I keep on referring to Germany because the Russians were also there before the Bonn conference, and when you speak to them, they're keeping it quite low now, and they're just waiting for what the US does. China...
But let me inform you that just after the Bonn conference, the US Secretary of State visited Brussels,
right,
where they had a conference of the ISAF foreign ministers on the situation, where Russia also came into consideration. And at the press conference, where I was also there, somebody asked her about her comments on Putin, which were, very volatile. And she continued her diatribe. So, in fact, Mr. Putin appears to be a little upset with the US at the moment. So Russia may be quiet, but it's simmering.
Oh, no, of course. I mean, they're all waiting for I think that they are waiting for the Americans to leave, of course. And Russia, I think, speaking to people over there, I mean, obviously they say that they do want reconciliation with the Taliban, and they want the Americans to leave. But again, we always speak about Americans leaving, but I don't know whether we've thought about they will still have presence in one form or another. And even now that these peace talks are going on, we tend to ignore the fact that the Americans are still going to be in the region, and how then Russia and China sees that, because the Chinese are not comfortable with any sort of presence, whether it's in small military bases or any sort of presence.
Right. So, Shehzad, you'd like to add something to it?
Yes, actually, yeah. I think two things I would want to say. Based on what Amna said, yes, I think that's absolutely correct, that the Americans have made a lot of investment in Afghanistan in terms of, bases that are being constructed, fairly, large-sized facilities. Even with conversations with former diplomats and stuff, both here and some people abroad, analysts abroad, you find out that there's certain strategic interests that the U.S. does have in the area, and I think it would like to maintain a presence. And also, I mean, yes, 2014 it might be the date of withdrawal, but we know that the American strategy has changed a little bit. We've gone back to counterterrorism, and that means having these sort of rapid reaction forces, using the use of drone strikes, etc. And I think a lot of that work will take place.
But look at it this way: that if they are talking to the Taliban,
right,
the Taliban are never going to agree to a prolonged U.S. military presence in Afghanistan beyond 2014.
Yes, that's the Taliban position. I mean, but the Taliban had also said that we're not going to start talking till all international forces leave Afghanistan, but now they've obviously compromised on that
Well,
as well.
as all three of you said, that realism has set in.
Perhaps, yes, pragmatism, yes, is perhaps, the word.
Okay.
Perhaps they will ultimately be willing to concede some kind of American presence in the north, where the U.S. itself is much more safe. The dynamics obviously are yet to be explored.
But since your view is from Washington, can you provide us some input on 2012 being the U.S. presidential election year? And Obama has been, you see, losing popularity, so he's bound to take a few steps which sort of restore his position. How do you look at that vis-a-vis Afghanistan?
Right. Well, first of all, I think it's wonderful that you're talking about the domestic politics, because it's very, very important. Now, I think when President Obama gets on the campaign trail much more fully and he begins speaking on foreign policy with his opponents, possibly Mitt Romney, he's going to talk about that, look, Bush started the war, but I brought the war in Iraq to an end. I brought the boys back home. We're all gone. That's at least the domestic pitch. When it comes to Afghanistan, what he would like to see is that I brought 30,000 of these soldiers back. I sent the boys in there in 2009, and here we are, 2.5 years later, 30,000 of them have come back, and I'm winding the war in Afghanistan down. I think that, which is why also we see this push with the U.S. to open the office and move on the diplomatic front, so we could, say, okay, look, now we're talking to them, we're trying to create peace and stability in the country. Of course, as we know, I personally know people who are going on the next rotation, so the 30,000 are not being brought back necessarily. There are other people who are going in, including, as I said, people who I'm aware of.
No, it's interesting to listen to your view from Washington. So, Air Marshal, do you agree with what this young man says about Obama's politics? And also, I would like you to talk about now Pakistan's possible role in the endgame.
Yeah, perhaps it's too early to say, but I think Obama is, at the moment, more likely to win a second term. And if that happens, I think his policies will perhaps prevail. His policy is to wind the war down in Afghanistan. His policy will be, perhaps in the remaining 4 years of the next term, is to be able to bring everyone back, leaving perhaps about 10 to 15,000 troops back there for whatever counterterrorism. Look, the point here is that if the Al-Qaeda is assumed to have been finished or possibly finished off in Afghanistan, all that is left is Taliban. And if most of the Taliban agree to mainstream themselves along with the policy that is the major Afghan government or the mainstream Afghan government, then therefore there is no dissidents, so to say, now in Afghanistan to be countered or the terrorists to be taken out. There could be a few, but then those can perhaps be taken out by the security forces. So it is still a very open-ish question. The second issue that we need to keep in mind is that Obama in his new defense policy or defense strategy has outlined a 1.5 war capability. Till date, we had a 2 war capability within the American forces. There's 1.5 war means essentially a war in South China Sea or in the Pacific, and secondly a presence of half a war being fought somewhere in the Gulf area. Now that's what they're thinking of in terms of 1.5 war. Now that 1.5
You're alluding at the Strait of Hormuz?
So therefore what the possibility is that it's going to be a drawdown of forces, especially out of Europe, essentially. That is one. And secondly, perhaps most of it from the remaining parts of Asia. So when you look at that, well, 10 to 15,000 is not going to be too many troops in Afghanistan, and perhaps they will not be as effective, because if 1.5 lakh have not done enough in Afghanistan, I don't think 15, 20,000 will do much. And anyway, Afghanistan is expected to now stabilize itself, with most of the parties now be getting mainstreamed, including the Taliban. If that happens, I find that the threats to the region or to Afghanistan will minimize and mitigate considerably. Pakistan should continue to play a positive role, encouraging, influencing people to go and talk to the Americans, as well as, remember, we have these 3 players. I mean, we should not perhaps try and make the situation more complex as we go into the end game. The SCO is an important forum, but I think essentially 3 players still remain: the US, Afghanistan, and the Pakistanis. Now, these 3 must work together to bring about a good, stable end game in Afghanistan. And if that happens, I think we should be able to see Pakistan continuing to play a positive role in terms of its relationship.
So, Amna, as we are drawing towards the conclusion of this program, very quickly, how do you see Pakistan's role in the end game?
Well, you see, I think probably my views differ from others, but I think we made a mistake initially of alienating the different other ethnic groups in Afghanistan. And unfortunately, there's so much mistrust between Pakistan and the other ethnic groups. It's difficult to overcome this within a short period of time.
What should we do?
But I think, yes, the thing is that Pakistan now sincerely needs to open up to the other ethnic groups, and it needs to establish relations with all the different ethnic groups, because we need I know it's all the same mantra, but we need a peaceful Afghanistan for us, number one. And I think we need to push for the peace process. I don't think Pakistan should feel alienated because it's in Qatar and that Pakistan right now hasn't been involved. Pakistan is an important player, and there is no way that there can be any sort of peace in Afghanistan without Pakistan. So Pakistan should know that it will be a part of the peace process. But now if the Americans are doing their little bit in Qatar, let it be that way. But we will be involved.
Right. Your concluding comments on Pakistan's role, and how do you look at it also that the Afghan National Army is likely to take over by 2014 the elements of security?
Yeah, I completely agree with Amna's position. First of all, I think we need to stop laying our eggs here in Pakistan in the Taliban basket or the Pashtun basket. And yes, we have been apparently reaching out to some former members of the Northern Alliance. I think it's a good policy. We need to seek more allies in the existing government. And many Pakistanis do feel threatened by the Afghan security forces, primarily because they're being trained by India. But I think we need to work.
Besides that, you see the Afghan National Army, for example, especially in the north, is likely to comprise a majority of Tajiks,
right,
with whom we have not, as she pointed out, have reached out earlier.
And that's exactly what we need to start doing. Yes, we have our concerns that the numbers should be limited of the forces as a whole, but we need to reach out to the Tajik leadership and within the government and within the military and try to increase our influence, but through softer means. The hard power stuff has to go out of the window.
Okay. So, viewers, with that we come to the end of this very interesting discussion. All three panelists agree that the end game in Afghanistan has started. 2012 was a very important year, and Pakistan also needs to get its act together. The important thing is to reach out to the various ethnic groups rather than hang our hat on only one single peg. I would like to thank you, Air Marshal and Amna Khan and Shehzad Qazi. Viewers, keep sending us your comments. Hope to see you next week, inshallah. Allah Hafiz.